Today on Put 'em on the Couch, I'll continue my discussion of memory. What is your earliest memory? For me, it was more than 45 years ago. I must have been 4 years old, maybe. I can see myself standing on one side of the fence and a slightly bigger, older girl standing on the other. I recollect trying to open the handle, but there was a lock, like a padlock on the gate. Ostensibly to play with her, I guess. My mother would later tell me that the little girl, she was our next door neighbor. No matter what you are, no matter who you are, no matter what your age, this question always delivers, doesn't it? When I ask my students this same question, many of them remember with great excitement their earliest recollections. They must have been, as they put it, 5, 6, certainly elementary school aged. For most, it's a great reminder of how utterly strange our recollections can be, and how weird it is that some memories form early in life and others, well, they seem to take longer. Often there seems to be no rhyme or reason to which year we have our first memories, or which year our first memories are based upon, let alone which memories from that particular year or time period we conjure up. And no matter who you ask, it seems that everyone is wildly interested in taking these sort of mental jaunts through time. While most people who engage in this little memory exercise recall things from their childhood, let's say again around elementary school age, 4 or 5, some, albeit a very small percentage, maybe 0.5% to 2%, seem capable of spelunking depths even further back into time, back to toddlerhood, infancy, or even pre-birth. Just consider Andy. When interviewed, he recalled that his earliest memory, rather ambivalently, was less than positive. While you could definitely see a wry smile on his face as he began to tell the story, his expression quickly changed as he got further into it. And honestly, I became a little concerned and uncomfortable for him. Andy said he remembered being just a few weeks old, lying in the bed, and his brother, then 4 years old, trying to choke him. What? I asked. Literally choke you? Yeah. My brother was trying to feed me a hot dog when I was just a few days or weeks old, Andy said. Are you sure? Are you sure that you actually remember this? Yes, he said, very confidently. Now, this story holds a particular spell over me, since Andy is my youngest brother of 4 years. As a brother, this story makes me cringe. It makes me wonder, did I really try to kill my brother when he was just a few weeks old? Talk about sibling rivalry. As a 25-plus year psychology professor, however, this little exercise inspires me to ask some other questions. For instance, is this really so uncommon or strange? If my brother can remember things this far back, why can't all of us? Are memories that are associated with negative emotions like fear or pain or anger easier or more likely to be remembered than those associated with positive emotions like contentment or happiness? Could this be the explanation for why my brother's memory seems to go so far back? And is there any reason why we should doubt those who have such early recollections? I mean, everybody has a first memory, right? So logically, it stands to reason one of your memories has to be the oldest. To explore what might be going on here, let's turn to the research. When researchers ask a large number of people the same question, what is your first memory? Most recall situations or events after age 4. Caroline Mills, in her survey in 1895, found the same exact distribution. While most people remember things as their first memory past age 4 or 5, a handful of people, a very small percentage that is, did claim to remember things before age 4. Caroline Mills referred to this as childhood amnesia. Sometimes psychologists and other memory researchers today refer to this as infantile amnesia. While explanations for this vary, most memory scientists today believe the necessary brain areas like the prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and hippocampus are simply underdeveloped before age 4. So therefore, most of us simply lack the necessary brain maturity to create, let alone lay down or stabilize long-term memories. But a small percentage, my brother among them, do have much earlier recollections. And I would never assume people, certainly not my brother, were lying or simply making up stories for attention. Besides, there are ways to check or corroborate these sorts of claims, especially my brother's hot dog story. And as it turned out, my efforts to corroborate his recollections is simultaneously the reason I got an answer to a related question that I didn't even know I was looking for. Assuming my brother and others whose memories go back before the maturation of these brain areas I just mentioned are not lying when they say they remember things from age 4, 2, or even back to birth, how or where would they get such things from? If not from their memory, what might be the source?
We have a name for that. That's called source confusion or source misattribution. It's very common for people to feel that they know something or think something, and they attribute it to one source when it actually came from another source. So people will mistakenly think that they did something when they actually dreamed it, or they will not be sure whether they actually did something or just thought about doing those things. These are natural memory confusions that occur in lots and lots of people.
And that was Elizabeth Loftus, 40-year veteran in the field of memory science.
So, do you recognize any of these men?
I was hiding in the bathroom stall, so I didn't see his face, but I heard him. He was singing along to the music at the bar.
Do you remember what he was singing?
I think it was that song, I Want It That Way.
Backstreet Boys, I'm familiar. Okay.
So according to Dr. Loftus, some information about your memory may come from places outside of your actual memory. Still part of your recollection, since your brain records and keeps up with things throughout your life. In my brother's case, at least, when I prompted him a little further, a little harder, he said, well, I guess it's possible that I could be remembering the event of you trying to feed me a hot dog from other sources, but I just don't know what they would be. And I was like, Andy, of course you do. The way mom, the way my great-grandmother, the way myself would talk about the event, it seemed like most of the time when we would all get together, he would bring this up. When he was 5, 10, 15, he would say, hey, Jay, remember that time you tried to kill me as an infant? And everyone would chime in. There were also photographs of my great-grandmother's house, photographs of my brother Andy when he was a baby. So all of these things, to use Elizabeth Loftus's terminology, provided attribution sources or attribution distortions, provided the fodder, if you will, for remembering something after the fact. And think about one of the great sources of misattribution today. Yeah, cell phones. We take photographs and videos of everything from childhood forward. In fact, we're going to be talking about smartphones and the benefits and the trouble with them in the very next episode coming up in about a week. So stay tuned for that. Now I'd like to fast forward a little bit, literally and figuratively. In the 1990s, when I was in my 20s, my grandfather, then perhaps in his 60s, used to look at me and say, boy, I wish I was your age again. Or, boy, you better enjoy every minute of this life you've got right here. These will be the best years of your life. You'll remember these years forever. He said, you might not know it now, but this is as good as it gets. Admittedly, I had no idea what he was talking about. But recently, I was mining some old studies in memory research, and I came across something that reminded me of these comments my grandpa used to make to me when I was in my 20s. It turns out that in the 1980s and 1990s, memory researchers found that when asked, what is the most significant memory you can recall, people similar to mine and my brother's age, 40 plus, showed a bit of similarity. Turns out most recall a larger number of events between ages 20 and 30. My grandpa would be so proud that science confirmed what he already seemed to know. This reminiscence bump, as psychologists now refer to the phenomenon, is one of the most robust findings in the autobiographical memory literature. While several explanations for why this occurs, the life script theory seems to be the most accepted. It assumes that people's most significant memories tend to center upon their 20s and 30s, as this is the time when most of them are forming the most significant parts of their lifelong identity or life narrative. And it's not that life stops after 30, quite the opposite. But researchers think that most of the big ticket items take place during this decade. Graduation from college, first career, marriage, kids, house, perhaps moving to another state, the loss of an important loved one in your life, etc. Here's researcher Julia Shaw discussing the reminiscence bump as it relates to Brexit.
The reminiscence bump suggests that most of us, cross-culturally, have an increase in the amount of memories that we have from the ages between 10 and 25. Why? One theory suggests it has to do with your identity. These are the times of your life when you define who you are. These are the autobiographical memories that make you you. Now, there's another one which says, well, they're also the firsts. It's your first kiss, your first job, your first, and we remember firsts better because there's something called a primacy effect. And so the combination of these things suggests that we have this bump. Now, this bump happens to correlate with political decision making. We see that, for example, in Brexit, 40 was about the cutoff for people who were voting to leave the EU as opposed to remain in the EU. Potentially, they had a biased view that said, wow, with my rosy reminiscence and my reminiscence bump, things were great, even though maybe they weren't as great.
Dr. Shaw's insights shed light on the fascinating phenomenon of the reminiscence bump, revealing exactly how our memories and our politics might coincide, even explaining how and why people 40 and above seem to want to go back to the good old days before England became part of the EU, while all of the younger people perhaps didn't have this reminiscence bump opportunity, wanted to stay within the European Union. No doubt, our reminiscence, our recollections provide an opportunity to shape or continue to shape our identity as well as our perceptions about the world and others. And as we navigate through the labyrinth of memory, I think it's important for us to recognize that not all recollections are as reliable as we might hope. Just as our memories of cherished moments can shape our narratives, they can also deceive us. Again, Elizabeth Loftus.
There's a common lay belief that memory works like a recording device. You just record the experience and later on you play it back, but that is not the way memory actually works. Memory is actually more of a constructive process. When we remember something, we're actually taking bits and pieces of experience, bringing them together to essentially construct what feels like an actual memory. So I like to say that memory works a little bit more like a Wikipedia page because you can go in there and edit it, but so can other people.
And Loftus should know. In 1974, she and a colleague named Palmer did a very clever experiment. They started by showing students, about 40 of them, at the University of Washington, where Loftus was a professor early in her career, a mock automobile accident. Now, this was not high-quality video. In 1974, it was more like a slideshow. I'm not even sure that there was sound associated with it, so it was kind of a sketchy, grainy, stills sort of almost flip book quality video. Nevertheless, after students watched, they were split into several groups. One group received a question that asked, how fast would you estimate the cars were going when they contacted each other? Another group was asked the same question, but the word contacted was replaced with hit. How fast were the cars going, do you think, when they hit each other? Another group heard the word bumped, another heard the word collided, and another heard the word smashed. And what the researchers were looking for was to see whether or not memory truly is constructed and reconstructed. You see, if memory was simply like a recording, then all of the students, certainly people across all groups, would estimate a similar speed, whether they got the speed right or wrong. However, if memories are constructed in the first place and then reconstructed when recollected, well, the way people think about, the way people talk about, the information that's presented to people after the fact could, in fact, sway their memories of the original source. And this is exactly what Loftus and Palmer found. Those students who were asked to estimate the speed the cars were going when they contacted each other, on average, estimated that the cars were traveling about 32 miles an hour. By comparison, those who were asked to estimate how fast they were going when they bumped one another, they estimated a much higher speed, about 38 miles an hour. And finally, those on the very other end who heard the word smashed, well, they estimated an average speed of over 40 miles an hour. Now, there were some other associated questions that I think my listeners might find very interesting. So just go into Google and type in Palmer and Loftus, 1974, mock car accident experiment, and you can read all about this. Now, it's one thing to misremember or get your memory distorted for a mock car accident. What Loftus and Palmer demonstrated was that memories are, in fact, malleable. They're editable. But the question is, to what extent? I mean, it's one thing for us to misremember a detail about something from our past, but it's quite another for us to do something dramatic, like invent a whole memory of something, particularly something heinous or something that could potentially hurt us or someone else for the rest of our lives. Here's another memory expert, Sal Kassin, talking with Hidden Brain's Shankar Vedantam about what inspired him to start asking questions about how the brain works, specifically as it relates to our most precious recollections.
In the 6th grade, Saul Kassin received an assignment from his teacher to write a book report. It took him about a nanosecond to decide to write about his hero, Mickey Mantle.
I was a huge Yankees fan, and I wanted to do a really good job.
The baseball star was not the only object of Saul's affections. His 6th grade teacher was up on a pedestal too.
I loved Mrs. Avery. I had a crush, to be honest, on Mrs. Avery. I wanted to impress Mrs. Avery, and so I spent a lot of time on this book report. I just remember being excited to get the grade back. I thought it was a really good paper. I'd spent a lot of time on it. And when she called me up, she would call people and they'd come up and get their paper. This was toward the end of the school day. And I just remember her glaring at me in such a way that I looked at the grade, and there was, with a circle around it, a big red F. I said, I don't understand. And she says, well, you plagiarized it.
Saul found himself dumbfounded. He loved Mrs. Avery, and he loved Mickey Mantle, and he had poured his heart and soul into the book report.
I didn't want to break out into tears in front of my classmates and in front of her, so I held it together. I got home, flicked open the door, there was my mother, and I burst out crying. Mrs. Avery accused me of cheating. She didn't ask me if I plagiarized, she told me that I did.
And this memory would go on to motivate Sal Kassin for the rest of his career. In 1989, while a professor of psychology at Williams College, Sal Kassin watched along with the rest of the nation as TV outlets covered the story of a heinous crime committed late in the night in Central Park, New York. While most crimes are not that remarkable and hardly ever capture anyone's attention, this one was uniquely memorable and egregious. A young jogger had been beaten and raped within an inch of her life. She was hospitalized. There, she lay in a coma. There was no culprit. Instead, there were 5 culprits, all black or Hispanic, teenagers, 14, 15, and 16 years old. Like Saul had experienced with Miss Avery, police investigators in this case, along with the rest of the prosecution team, were certain that all 5 of these young men were guilty. There was no presumption of innocence. They had done it. And it wasn't that odd for the authorities to be convinced of this. Why? Well, after all the teens had confessed during their interrogations. I mean, who would confess to something they didn't do? Clearly, it's logical and perhaps even expected for the guilty to lie and say that they're innocent. But really, would an innocent person ever admit to guilt? Let's put a pin in that for a minute. We'll come back to that. In 1932, a very famous aviator named Charles Lindbergh became even more famous when his child, baby Lindbergh, was abducted. The Lindberghs were desperate to get their child back and hoped that someone would come forward with information that would lead to the return of Lindbergh's young infant son. 200 people confessed to this kidnapping. You see, voluntary false confessions are really strange, but they do occur. Who would ever admit guilt to something they were innocent of? Well, lots of people. Obviously, the 200 people in the Lindbergh case, because they could get notoriety, some kind of fame, despite the fact that it's mired with icky creepiness. Henry Lee Lucas, speaking of creepy, was once considered one of the most prolific serial killers on the earth. Why? He confessed to hundreds of murders. How many was he actually convicted of? 11. So when confessions are volunteered without any coercion, without any prompting, the police often are and should be very, very skeptical. But this isn't what happened in the case of the Central Park Five. Cassin explains.
For a city that was already on edge, this was the breaking point. The papers were just filled with headlines that, we got to solve this. I understand fully that when this happened and when it was reported and the heinousness of the crime, the city was in a state of outrage and demanding that we find who did this. Within 72 hours, NYPD solved the case. There were a number of kids running through the park that night, wreaking havoc on some bystanders, and police immediately started rounding people up, going into their neighborhoods, bringing others in. They interrogated all sorts of kids and ultimately found 5 kids who confessed, 14, 15, 16 years old. The way New York City worked their confessions in those days, starting in the 1970s, 1980s, was the detectives interrogated off camera. They brought their suspect to a point where they were ready to confess, and then they delivered them to an assistant district attorney who stepped in with a camera on and took the confession.
Would you please tell us what your full name is?
Armstrong Lamont McCrae.
McCrae?
Could you please state your full name?
Carrie Jamel Porter Wise.
Okay. Would you please sit up and tell me what your name is?
My name is Remy Santana.
I'm sorry, you have to speak a little louder.
Remy Santana.
And how old are you?
14.
They described the jogger as she was running. They described her location. They described dragging her down through the grass. There were clear tread marks. And they gave a description of a woman who had been beaten in the head with a hard object, clothes pulled off, and left for dead.
And you just left her laying in the bushes?
Yes.
Did you try to hide her so she wouldn't get found?
No. I ain't trying to hide her. They pushed over.
You cannot look past those statements on video. They got some of the facts right. They're basically telling the same story. There are some annoying disparities and contradictions between them, but they get enough facts right.
What's your last name, please?
Wise.
Weiss. And how old are you?
16.
Do you go to school?
Yes, ma'am.
Where do you go to school?
The Bronx Stevenson High School.
And what grade are you in there?
10th.
He said he was involved in the rape. He was present and he played a minimal role. I believe he said he had held her legs while someone else pulled her pants down.
I wasn't doing as much as they was doing.
Were you going up to her crotch?
No. I was about to. I said no. I could see the expression on her face there, and I felt kind of bad. This is my first extreme I did to any type of female in the street.
When you hear a statement like that, he not only describes what happened, but then describes his own expression of remorse. I'm sorry I did this, he basically said. This is my first rape. It's going to be my last.
This is my first rape. I never did this before. This will be my last time doing it. This is my first experience. This will be my last. So when they did that,
here's a confession that's not just communicating an admission of guilt and some narrative details that are accurate in relation to the crime facts, but now he's reflecting on his own motivation and remorse and acceptance of responsibility. How does a judge and a jury look past that statement? And so they sent me 2 big Xerox type boxes, and I spent the next couple of weeks probably doing terrible teaching at Williams because I was completely distracted by this case. And when I was done, I was horrified. There was no evidence of their guilt. The confessions were contradictory.
All 5 of these young men remembered things as per their confession that seemed to prove, at least at first, that they must have been at the scene of the crime, at the very least, if not the perpetrators who actually committed this heinous beating and rape. But it turns out when Sal Cassin went back through the boxes and boxes of transcripts, what he found was astonishing. There was no clear evidence that any of these young men had committed a crime. Instead, what he found was an argument to be made that their memories had been contaminated, that the police investigators off camera had indeed fed each of these young men information about the crime.
I didn't know this in 1989, but I learned in 2002 that detectives showed Corey Wise pictures of the victim. So he was able to describe her. He was taken to the crime scene. He gave a vivid description of the crime scene. They all did. Turns out 2 of them were taken to the crime scene. Now, that's contaminating their memories. And this is not their statement. You've motivated and incentivized them because they think it's in their best interest to cooperate, and you've spoon-fed them information to provide a compelling, accurate confession.
They were prompted. They were given leading information, given descriptions of the jogger, giving descriptions of the crime scene. And at least in 2 cases, there's evidence that 2 of the young men were driven to the crime scene and shown the crime scene. Now, as Loftus and Palmer have demonstrated, the way you talk about a memory can affect the memory itself. This is to say nothing of the fact that these young men had no support, they had no attorneys present, that none of the interrogation was caught on videotape, because in the 1970s and 1980s, police officials were not required to use videotape in their interrogations. Still closer to home, Ronald Cotton, a North Carolinian, was wrongfully convicted of rape in 1984. His prosecution was based in large part on the testimony of an eyewitness and alleged victim, Jennifer Thompson. Despite maintaining his innocence, Cotton served over a decade in prison before DNA evidence exonerated him in 1995. Jennifer, who was certain of her memory and of the alleged perpetrator Cotton's guilt, later realized her mistake and publicly apologized for her role in the wrongful conviction. The case of Ronald Cotton and Jennifer Thompson, as well as the case of the Central Park Five, serve as a stark reminder of the fallibility of memory more generally and of eyewitness testimony more specifically. So I'd like to wrap things up by recapping our exploration of memory today. We started with how we can't remember much from when we were babies. Then we talked about why we tend to remember our 20s and 30s maybe the most. Remember that car crash study? That showed us how easily our memories can get messed up, especially the way in which people talk about or we talk to other people after the fact. Then we looked at how people can be coerced or forced into confessing to things that they never did, like what happened to the Central Park Five or to North Carolina native Ronald Cotton. And don't forget about Jennifer Thompson, who wrongly identified him, Ronald Cotton, as her attacker. All these stories remind us that memory isn't as reliable as we think, that to use the words of Elizabeth Loftus is more like a Wikipedia page than a recording device. We can change things, and so can other people. So when it comes to the justice system, when it comes to our understanding of memory, when it comes to eyewitnesses, we need to be careful. We need to learn from these and other stories and make sure that we're always looking for truth, even when our memories might otherwise get in the way.
Number 1, could you please sing the opening to I Want It That Way?
Really? Okay. You are my fire.
Number 2, keep it going.
The one desire.
Number 3,
believe when I say.
Number 4,
I want it that way.
tell me why.
Ain't nothing but a heartache.
Tell me why.
Ain't nothing but a mistake.
Now number 5,
I never wanna hear you say, woo! I want it that way.
Ah, chills. Literal chills.
It was number 5. Number 5 killed my brother.
Oh my God, I forgot about that.